Welcome back to the Social Work Race. This is going to be a very intense topic. Member of the public, anyone out there interested in sociology and psychology and behaviors just needs to listen to this. This is an interesting one. It's a topic that's gone on in my family, with my friendship groups for years. And I'm reflecting on a TikTok that I posted. Just go back to my TikTok on physical chastisement. Let me introduce to you as to how we are talking about this today. So there was a post from a woman, a woman online that I reacted to, where she was asking the question: is it right, and shouldn't the system recognize cultural diversity and differences, where a man had beaten his son in front of his friends and they ran out of the house scared? I think he was a Nigerian man, and so his son was taken from him. Right. That's the long and short of it. And so the question is being asked: shouldn't we recognize that there's differences in culture? That's not right. And so you don't recognize and understand the importance of beating your child. And so I went further into the session by saying, I remember being beaten when I was growing up. And being beaten, when I say beaten, I don't mean a smack. I was smacked and beaten. I just want to be clear. I love my parents. I love my dad. But it was interesting because I reflected and said that all of my uncles, aunts, and the vast majority of the people that I grew up with, similar age, we laugh about the history of how we were reprimanded, chastised, with a belt and so forth, right? And there is absolutely no hatred on my part to my dad, because I get it. And so my post was saying, do not hit your kids, right? Now, I grew up in a time where hitting your kids was the norm in the black community, African and West Indian. That's what I mean by black. And I want you to understand that being a norm, there are some people that are thinking, well, that's the reason why society has gone downhill. I don't agree with that. I think that society has gone downhill because there were no dads with the boys, with the children, to equalize the family dynamic. I think that's the issue. But beating your children, my encouragement was to not do that. And so I thought today, let me do a session on why we did it in the first place. Why did we, or where did we learn? Where did anybody learn to beat their child? So when I say beat, again, I mean multiple lashes with the hand or a belt or a brush or whatever it might be. Now, it comes from frustration, but I think culturally is really what I'm talking about. So let's look at this culturally. And I'm going to speak primarily from a minority African, British, Caribbean perspective, okay? But I also want you to consider, I have a question for you at the end, and that question is about what you're going to do about it. So we'll get there in a moment. Let me read some research I've done to you so you can understand more of the context. Research shows that the practice of beating children was not an intrinsic cultural tradition in Africa and the West Indies, but rather a colonial influence. Studies have found no evidence that ritualistic forms of physical discipline of children existed in the pre-colonial West African societies prior to the Atlantic slave trade. Historians and anthropologists suggest that Europeans brutalized their own children for thousands of years prior to colonizing Africa. The fact that the majority of captives were young is significant. So just to be clear about that, slave traders would take the youngest, obviously, because they could mold them and they would have the most energy and so forth. So the fact that the majority of captives were young is significant for understanding the evolution of African American child rearing practices. Bringing over mostly youth, coupled with the violent suppression of West African cultural practices, meant that traditional African child rearing practices were lost. So we were now, when slaves for 500 years in foreign lands, we had lost, just in one generation easily, our understanding of what it means to be appropriately raised as a child. So we are now taking on the colonizers' ideals and ideas of raising a child, right? Research shows that the practice of beating children, this is another study. Research shows that the practice of beating children was not an intrinsic cultural tradition in Africa and the West Indies, but rather a colonial influence. Again, African Americans adopted the practice of beating children from white slave masters. Europeans brutalized their own children for thousands of years, and it says it again. Again, he says, historians and anthropologists have found no evidence that ritualistic forms of beating and physical discipline of children existed in pre-colonial West African societies prior to the slave trade. Maltreatment was the norm, and children were civilized by routine beatings and worse. The use of physical punishment and physical abuse is no longer acceptable. Therefore, there is no evidence that slaves beat their children in order to survive. It was interesting because we were trying to work out, in my discussions with friends, where did it start? And we drew the conclusion, without even doing studies as such, that this was not the case in Africa. Where did we learn to do this? Why is this a thing? And is it still a thing in Africa, right? I don't know. I've never seen anything about Africans in all the documentaries that I love to watch. I've never seen anything about ritualistic or you have to beat the child. Where does it come from? And we've just expressed it now. We're going to read the final article now, a snippet from the final article, and it says here, corporal punishment, again, was not an intrinsic cultural tradition in Africa and the West Indies, but rather a colonial influence. The use of physical force against children has deep roots, and throughout history, children were objectified as subhuman, the property of adults to do as they pleased. The historical roots of corporal punishment in Black communities can be traced back where? To slavery and colonization. After slaves were emancipated in 1865, the rules of racial etiquette and ritualistic beatings continued as a new kind of coercive Southern labor system emerged that deepened on Black child workers. Wow. With sanctioning from the Black church, Black parents enacted the master's lash to instill obedience. Therefore, it can be concluded that corporal punishment was a result of colonial influence on slavery mothers. Come on, this is a pill to swallow, right? Because if this act in the year 2023, and I'm speaking towards minority families in the UK, even in America, is still in play, then we know that there are a lot of other things from colonialism that are still in play. That's not the only practice that comes through. And if that's the case, everybody has to reflect and say, I'm still a product of slavery. And I can say this, even though it didn't start in Africa, even if you are European or white, if you are doing this to your child, you are a product of slavery. So now you know that humanity was raising their children without the use of beating. You can do something different. You can. And here's my question to social workers. And I think that I'm going to actually include it in my assessments. And this is it. Are you going to include this information in your assessments? Do you think it's appropriate to include this information in your assessments? I do, but you may not agree. But I think it's enlightening. And remember, the assessment itself is a piece of work that when you have written it and it's been QA'd, the family is going to read it. And when they read it, it could be an educational document for them as a pathway out. Just like the actual plan in the assessment is, it can be a part of the education forming for them to act and think differently. And so that's my question to you. Are you going to use this information in your assessments, and do you think it should be in there? This was intense, because remember, slavery ended about 160 years ago, which is not long. And so again, my grandmother knew her grandmother who was a slave, right? And she was 95. She died about 6 years ago. And she has brought down, and I've identified a number of ways of that she would think, coming here on that Windrush boat to make a new life. She had slave mentality, and she's passed it down to my mom, who's passed it on to me. And so it's not just my mom, and it's not just West Indians, it's Africans, it's Native British, it's Americans, it's Europeans. Everybody is a victim. Stop putting your hands on your children. You don't need to. Find another way. And if you are struggling, ask for help. And I hope this helps. Take care of yourself.